The term food crisis is essentially a media confection. We hear periodically that we're in food crises of one kind or another. But when people talk about food crises in the media, what they're talking about is some sort of bubbling up of awareness and perhaps an acute moment where a lot of people at the same time have suddenly become malnourished or suddenly become food insecure, or suddenly food is an issue for the bourgeoisie, because at the moment we have around 800 million people who are malnourished and 2.3 billion people who are food insecure. But that's part of a chronic condition of the sort of four C's of hunger. That's right now it's capitalism, climate, COVID, and conflict. And when all of those things come together, you have a sort of resurgence of hunger around the world. Now, a crisis is what happens when the media pays attention to that, and when you have acute moments like you're having in South Africa right now, where all of a sudden large groups of people newly can't find food, swelling the ranks of people who are already chronically food insecure and chronically hungry. It's important to remember that, yes, things are fairly dark, and I don't want to dismiss or in any way play down the seriousness of waves of new people suddenly finding that it's hard to find food and reliably bring it to their tables and to their families and to their communities. But it is important to remember that it's a peak on top of a very, very, very large wave of numbers of people who are hungry. Again, these four C's of conflict, climate, COVID, and capitalism are certainly driving factors behind the chronic hunger. And obviously now COVID has made everything much worse. But it's very interesting to see where COVID made things worse. In societies where there was a great deal of pre-existing inequality, where capitalism had generated billionaires and a vast underclass, those countries did much worse in terms of hunger than countries that were relatively equal and that had in various ways succeeded in taming the worst effects of capitalism. So, for example, think of the most capitalist places. In the United States, for example, we had 10 million more people who are food insecure, and we have waves upon waves of hungry children in the United States as a result of COVID, whereas in Europe, although hunger and food insecurity did get worse, it was a little bit better. So again, look to these external shocks of conflict, climate, and COVID affecting and deepening the underlying structures of inequality that capitalism has already generated, and then throw on top of that the sort of petrol of the disaster that is, for example, bad government in South Africa, and then you have yet another layer of reasons why we have an acute food crisis. But again, there's compelling cases for saying that South Africa's neoliberal government is and the decay of that government and the capture of that government is precisely what happens when capitalism gets to play with the government in ways that the state capture, for example, discussions are laying bare at the moment. The UN published on Monday, just earlier on this week, new data on global hunger. And there's a certain amount of variability in the data, but essentially what we found is that certainly there are more than 2 billion and maybe 300 million more people because of COVID. So 2.3 billion people are now food insecure. That means that that they have they have real reasons to worry about being able to put food on the table. That's 1 in 3 people on Earth. And that's that's obviously an increase of 300 million from the year before. But what's particularly worrying is that the trends of the percentage of humans who are malnourished is also increasing, and that's very disturbing because even with playing with the numbers and dodging different definitions, it looked like things were getting better over the past 30 years. But that trend has really not held out since about 2014. Since 2014, the percentage of people around the world who are hungry has remained fairly constant, and now it's going up. And this runs counter to the sort of global ambitions of having zero people malnourished, because at the moment, as I say, there are about 800 million people who are malnourished. Now, malnutrition is absolutely not having enough food, and food insecurity is worrying about whether you do, whether there will be enough food at the moment. Malnutrition is much worse than, or undernourishment is much worse than, than food insecurity. But, all these figures are going up. And globally, as I say, they're worse in places where capitalism has run riot. And I should say, by the way, that the last comment I made about how things are worse in places where capitalism has run riot, the correct way of saying that is hunger has increased most dramatically under COVID, where capitalism has been most unequal. So I think that's that's a clearer way of saying that these exogenous shocks to the system are made worse by inequality. Now, when you hear the term food riot, again, this is a sort of confection of bourgeois media. There is a food riot wherever the cameras run and capture a burning tire, right? Otherwise, it's not a food riot, it's something else. And I think it's important, as E.P. Thompson does, to say that the word riot does not capture what's going on here. So language like food rebellion may make more sense, because to tell whether something is a rebellion, you need more than evidence of a burning tire. The data that you need is testimony. You need to ask people on the ground why they're doing things, as opposed to projecting your favorite political reason onto different communities. And so, one of the ways that food rebellions have been characterized in the past is not only by an antecedent set of circumstances where people had lost control over their ability to put food on the table, but then after a rebellion, you see a certain kind of war communism, right? You see people redistributing food. You see communities taking care of one another by sharing food. And that's how you know that a food rebellion has happened, is because communities are finding other ways of provisioning together for themselves, for their families, for their communities. And that's, I think, the data point that really matters. So, if you look at where it is that is being waylaid by these rebellions, what are the sites of struggle? Look to where the food is coming from, and look to the authorities who are preventing it. So you'll see protests against the police, for sure. You'll see protests against banks and multinationals, and you'll see protests at supermarkets where people go in and liberate food so that their families don't starve. And again, the way that food circulates, not in the market economy then, but in an economy of exchange and war communism, in a moment of survival and an exchange for survival, is the way that you tell whether a food rebellion has happened or not. And it seems from afar that what's happening in South Africa is a food rebellion. I mean, yes, you've got the layers of other kinds of politics read into it post facto by the press, but it doesn't seem to me, from what I'm hearing on the ground and what I'm reading in Newframe, that in fact this is some sort of pro and con Zuma proxy war. This is in fact a protest against the ongoing failure of the government and of South African capitalism to provide for the swelling ranks of hungry South Africans. And this is South Africans taking matters into their own hands because they know the government's not going to take care of them. Putting such vast power in the hands of large multinationals, has always been a big problem in South Africa, and of course that's been an endemic problem in the food system in South Africa. And now that South African supermarket and logistics monopolies have spread around the world, this is not just a South African problem, but certainly a sort of Pan-African issue, as ShopRite and Checkers and the various sort of multinationals and grocery chains make their way throughout the rest of the continent. But I certainly think that there are principles of food sovereignty that are being fought for around the world. I'm particularly heartened by some of the work that's happening in Latin America, for example, around peasant movements seizing power from governments and redistributing food, not just within peasant communities, but peasants sending food to areas in urban areas where food insecurity and COVID have hit particularly hard, when peasant communities have been able to organize in solidarity and create these solidarity economies. It has been in the absence of government as a sign of the kind of solidarity economy that they want to see. I mean, in South Africa, of course, what needs to happen is everything from land reform to transformations in the way that the economy is structured, and a move away from industrial agriculture towards agroecology. These are legitimate policy goals. Where they are practiced, they have yielded immense benefits in terms of hunger, in terms of nutrition, in terms of economy, in terms of environmental well-being, in terms of fighting climate change. So there are policies that can and should be adopted by the South African government, but the government is spineless in the face of these, of these large multinationals. And if you can't even have a decent debate about land reform in a country where, what is it, sort of 95% of the land pre-apartheid is still held by the same people after apartheid, then how are you going to have these tougher conversations around, dismantling monopolies and creating economies where agroecology is possible and where work is dignified and where everyone gets to eat? You can't even get that conversation off the ground. So, there's a great deal of work ahead for the South African people in making the government bend to the needs of people in the streets. And I think these food rebellions are a moment of reckoning for the government. And I very much hope that the organizing that's happening through these food rebellions opens the door to thinking about agroecology. So, I mean, in summary, if you want to understand why hunger is so much worse right now, think again about how the shocks of conflict, of climate change, and of COVID have exacerbated the inequalities that already exist under capitalism. Look to the areas where these inequalities were most acute, and those are the places that have comparatively done much worse in terms of hunger after these shocks have impacted the various parts of the world where capitalism has rendered societies most unequal. So yes, it's all well and good for us here in the global north to weather the storm. And even here in the United States, things are bad. There are people going hungry, not to the extent that they are in sub-Saharan Africa or in South Asia, for instance. But we still have food insecurity here in the United States, and it's rendered much worse, made more difficult by the fact that we are such an unequal society. And that's why, if you look everywhere where these shocks of COVID, climate, and conflict happen, it's worse because inequality makes a government less able and inclined to respond to the needs of the hungry.